My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 33 years old. 2 weeks ago, I stood in the back of a ballroom at the Grand Harbor Hotel in Chicago watching my father celebrate 40 years of his career, while nearly 200 people applauded him like he had built something legendary. Crystal chandeliers glowed above white linen tables, servers moved between guests carrying trays of champagne, and a giant banner behind the stage read, "Congratulations, Richard Hayes, 1984 to 2024. My father stood at the microphone with a glass of champagne raised high, while my mother smiled proudly beside him, and my younger brother Kyle stood in the front row already shaking hands with executives who clearly believed he would inherit the family company next. I should have known what was coming because moments like that had been happening my entire life. But what I didn't know was that in less than 5 minutes my husband was going to say something into that same microphone that would silence the entire room and change the way every person there looked at my family forever. My father cleared his throat and tapped the microphone twice. The room quieted instantly. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said with that confident voice he always used when he had an audience. 40 years ago, I started Hayes Industrial with one truck, a rented warehouse, and a lot of determination. Applause filled the ballroom. He talked about long nights, big deals, loyal employees, and how proud he was that his son Kyle would continue the Hayes legacy. Then he paused, glanced toward the back of the room where I was standing next to my husband Daniel, and smiled in that way that always made my stomach tighten because I knew a joke was coming and somehow I would be the punchline. "And, of course," he continued, lifting his glass slightly toward us, "there's my daughter Emily. She never quite had Kyle's business instincts, but luckily she married someone capable enough to carry her." Laughter rippled across the ballroom. Not cruel laughter, not even loud laughter, just that polite social laughter people give when the host makes a joke and everyone feels obligated to respond. But I felt every bit of it. 200 people hearing my father reduce my entire life to a punchline in the middle of his retirement speech. I kept my expression calm because that was a skill I'd perfected over decades. I didn't cry. I didn't react. I simply looked at Daniel. My husband didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. Instead, he slowly stood up from his chair. At first, people thought he was just getting ready to applaud. But Daniel walked straight toward the stage, past the front tables, past my mother's surprised expression, past Kyle who looked confused for a moment, and then he stepped up beside my father and gently took the microphone. The room grew quiet again, the way a crowd does when something unexpected interrupts a carefully planned speech. Daniel looked out across the ballroom and said in the calmest voice I have ever heard, "Before Richard finishes his speech, there's something everyone here deserves to know." My father frowned slightly, clearly irritated by the interruption, but Daniel continued, "Because tonight isn't just about retirement. It's also about ownership." And just like that, the room went completely silent. Glasses stopped halfway to people's lips. Conversations died instantly. 200 guests staring at my husband as if the air had suddenly changed. What Daniel said next would make several executives drop their champagne glasses and would leave my father standing there in front of his own retirement party realizing he no longer controlled the company he had just finished celebrating. But before I tell you exactly what my husband announced and why that ballroom went so quiet, take a quick second and tell me something in the comments because I always love seeing where these stories travel. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there right now? I'm always amazed when people say they're listening from Texas, New York, California, Canada, the UK, Australia, sometimes even halfway across the world. And if stories about family dynamics, underestimated people, and moments where the truth finally comes out resonate with you, go ahead and tap the like button and subscribe to the channel because it really does help more people discover these stories. Alright, now let me take you back to the beginning, because what happened at my father's retirement party didn't start that night. It started decades earlier in a house where one child was always the investment and the other was always the joke. People like to believe that success in a family business is about talent, dedication, and hard work. In the Hayes household, it was always about something much simpler than that. It was about who my parents believed was worth the investment. My younger brother Kyle was the investment. I was the backup plan no one expected to pay off. The difference started so early that by the time I was 10 years old it felt normal. On Kyle's 16th birthday, my father rolled a brand new black Ford Mustang into the driveway with a giant red ribbon across the hood. I remember standing on the front steps with a slice of grocery store cake in my hand while neighbors gathered to watch Kyle shout with excitement. My father tossed him the keys like it was a scene from a movie. I did not receive a car when I turned 16. I received Kyle's old laptop from middle school with a cracked corner and a battery that lasted about 40 minutes before it had to be plugged back in. My mother handed it to me at the kitchen table and said it would help me with homework. When Kyle graduated from high school, my parents paid $68,000 a year for him to attend a private business program at Northwestern University. My father told everyone at church that Kyle was going to be the future of Hayes Industrial. The following fall, when I left for college, I attended the University of Illinois with federal student loans, a part-time job at a coffee shop, and a used Toyota Corolla that had 212,000 miles on the odometer. The difference was never hidden. It was measured in numbers. Kyle's internship the summer after his sophomore year paid him $22 per hour and was arranged through one of my father's executive friends. My first internship paid $12 per hour, and I found it by sending out 43 applications online during spring semester. Family dinners were the clearest example of how the system worked. Every Sunday evening, my parents hosted dinner at the same large oak table that had been in the house since before I was born. My father would ask Kyle detailed questions about classes, networking events, and business strategy. My mother would nod proudly while Kyle explained concepts he had learned in finance lectures. When it was my turn to speak, the questions were shorter. Usually something like, "How are classes?" or "Are you keeping up with your grades?" I learned very early that if I spoke for too long, the conversation would quietly move back to Kyle. My father liked to say something that sounded almost like a compliment, but never quite was. He would smile at guests and say, "Emily is the creative one in the family. Kyle is the strategic one." People would laugh politely as if it was harmless. What it really meant was simple. Kyle would run the company. I would find something else to do with my life. For a long time, I believed them. When enough people repeat the same story about who you are, eventually it becomes easier to accept it than to argue. So I did not argue. I worked quietly instead. I studied economics and data analysis because numbers made sense in a way family conversations never did. Numbers did not care who your parents favored. Numbers simply told the truth if you knew how to read them. During my junior year of college, I started working part-time for a small consulting firm that specialized in operational efficiency for mid-sized manufacturing companies. It was not glamorous work. Most days I sat at a desk reviewing spreadsheets and inventory reports for businesses that produced everything from agricultural equipment to warehouse shelving. But something about it clicked in my brain almost immediately. Patterns began to appear in ways other analysts sometimes missed. I could look at a balance sheet and see where costs were leaking through the system. I could read a supply chain report and identify where delays were quietly draining profit margins. The senior consultant who supervised my internship once looked over my shoulder at a report I had been working on for 2 hours and asked how long it took me to notice the production inefficiency in the numbers. I told him about 15 minutes. He stared at me for a moment and then said that most people in the department had missed it entirely for 3 weeks. That was the first time anyone in a professional setting had looked at my work and treated it as something impressive rather than surprising. After graduation, I accepted a full-time position with that same consulting firm in downtown Chicago. The starting salary was $62,000 per year with health insurance and a modest retirement plan. It was not the kind of career my father bragged about at dinner parties, but it was stable, and it was mine. Meanwhile, Kyle joined Hayes Industrial immediately after finishing his degree. My father announced it proudly in the company newsletter. Kyle Hayes had been appointed junior operations manager with a starting salary of $180,000 per year plus performance bonuses. Every time the family gathered, my father would describe Kyle's future as if it were already written. Kyle would eventually take over the company. The Hayes name would continue for another generation. I would listen quietly and sip iced tea while my mother told relatives that I worked in consulting, which meant I traveled sometimes and helped businesses improve their systems. She always said it with the same tone people use when describing a hobby rather than a career. By the time I turned 32, Kyle had been promoted twice inside the company, and my father had begun introducing him at industry conferences as the next leader of Hayes Industrial. And somewhere during those same years, something else happened that my parents never paid attention to. I met Daniel. Daniel Carter did not enter my life in a dramatic way. There was no grand moment where everything suddenly changed. In fact, the first time I met him, it happened in a conference room that smelled faintly like burnt coffee and printer ink. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and my consulting firm had been hired to evaluate operational costs for a logistics company outside Chicago. I was 29 years old and 3 years into my career, sitting at a long table with 4 other analysts while we waited for the client's executive team to arrive. The door opened, and a man walked in carrying a slim leather folder and a laptop. He wore a navy suit, no tie, and the calm kind of confidence that does not need to announce itself. He introduced himself simply as Daniel Carter, a financial advisor working with the company's investment partners. During that meeting, something interesting happened. While most of the executives talked in circles about strategy and long-term growth, Daniel kept asking very specific questions about inventory flow, debt structure, and supplier contracts. The questions were precise enough that several people in the room had to pause before answering. At one point, he looked down at a chart projected on the screen and asked why the company had increased warehouse storage costs by 18% over 2 years, while shipping volume had only increased by 6%. The chief operations officer looked surprised and admitted that no one had raised that question yet. I remember noticing that because it was exactly the kind of pattern my brain had already been studying in the financial reports. After the meeting ended, Daniel approached me while I was packing my laptop into my bag. He asked if I had been the one who prepared the cost distribution analysis in the presentation. When I said yes, he smiled slightly and said it was the clearest breakdown he had seen during the entire review process. That was the beginning. Not fireworks. Just 2 people recognizing that the other saw the world in a similar way. Over the next few months, our work crossed paths several times because his firm frequently partnered with consulting groups like mine when evaluating investments. Sometimes our conversations were about data models and financial forecasts. Other times they were about the strange culture of corporate boardrooms where people with impressive titles often missed the simplest details hiding in plain numbers. Daniel had a way of listening carefully before speaking that felt very different from the conversations I was used to in my family. When he asked questions, he genuinely wanted the answer, rather than waiting for his turn to prove he already knew everything. About 6 months after that first meeting, he asked if I wanted to get dinner after a long day of reviewing reports for another client. We ended up sitting in a small restaurant near the Chicago River for almost 3 hours talking about careers, travel, and the quiet pressure that comes with growing up in families where expectations are clearly ranked. Daniel came from a very different background than mine. His parents had both been teachers in Ohio, and he had built his career step by step through finance internships, graduate school, and eventually joining an investment firm that specialized in restructuring mid-sized manufacturing companies. There was something steady about him that I immediately trusted. He never tried to impress me with stories about money or status. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious about how I approached problems and why I noticed patterns the way I did. About a year after we started dating, I brought Daniel to meet my parents for the first time. I already knew how that evening would go because I had seen the pattern many times before. My father asked Daniel questions about his career within the first 5 minutes of sitting down at the dining table. What firm did he work for? What kind of clients did he advise? What was the size of the investment portfolios he managed? Daniel answered politely, without exaggerating anything. When my father learned that Daniel's firm handled restructuring deals involving companies worth tens of millions of dollars, he raised his eyebrows in mild approval. It was the closest thing to respect my father usually offered someone outside his immediate business circle. But then the conversation shifted in the direction it always did. My father glanced at me and said with a half smile that Emily had always been more comfortable analyzing spreadsheets than leading companies. Daniel looked at him for a moment and then responded calmly that understanding numbers well enough to see problems before they happened was exactly what strong companies needed. My father laughed as if it was a clever joke rather than a serious point. But Daniel did not laugh. He simply continued eating his dinner and changed the subject to the manufacturing industry in Illinois. On the drive home that night, I apologized to him for the way my father spoke about me in front of people. Daniel looked genuinely confused by the apology. He said he had not heard anything surprising because sometimes families become so used to telling the same story about someone that they stop noticing whether it is true. Then he said something that stayed with me long after that evening. He said that the most dangerous thing in business is when leaders become so confident in their assumptions that they stop checking the numbers that prove whether those assumptions are right. At the time, I thought he was talking about corporate strategy. I did not realize yet that he had already started paying attention to something else entirely. The only person in my family who ever looked at me differently than the role assigned to me was my grandfather, Thomas Hayes. My grandfather did not speak often during family gatherings, but when he did, people usually listened because he had built the foundation of the company my father later expanded. Long before Hayes Industrial had a polished headquarters and a board of directors, my grandfather had run a small manufacturing workshop on the edge of Joliet with 8 employees and a single delivery truck. When I was growing up, he spent most afternoons in a quiet armchair near the window of my parents' living room reading newspapers and industry magazines while the rest of the family talked loudly about business plans and expansion ideas. Unlike my father, my grandfather rarely bragged about the company. He simply watched people. I remember one Sunday dinner when I was about 19 years old and home from college for the weekend. My father and Kyle were discussing a new contract with a supplier while my mother served roasted chicken and vegetables across the table. My father spoke for almost 20 minutes about profit margins and future growth projections. Kyle nodded along confidently and repeated phrases he had learned in business school. At one point, my father turned to me and asked what I thought about the deal. It was not a real question. It was the kind of polite gesture people make when they expect a short, harmless answer. I looked at the numbers they had printed on a sheet of paper and said that the supplier pricing structure looked unstable because transportation costs were rising faster than the contract accounted for. I explained that if fuel prices continued increasing the way they had over the previous 18 months, the supplier would eventually raise rates or cut quality to maintain their margin. The table went quiet for a moment, and then my father chuckled as if I had made an amusing observation. He said that supply chains were far more complicated than simple spreadsheet predictions. Kyle laughed lightly and said that the company had professionals monitoring those risks already. The conversation moved on quickly, but my grandfather had not laughed. He had watched me carefully while I spoke. After dinner that night, he asked me to help him carry a few boxes from the garage into the house. When we were alone, he set one of the boxes down on the kitchen counter and said something that surprised me. He said that most people in business only see numbers as confirmation of the story they already believe. Very few people are willing to let the numbers challenge the story. Then he told me something else that stayed with me long after that conversation. He said that confidence can look impressive in a meeting, but accuracy is what keeps companies alive. Over the next few years, my grandfather occasionally asked me small questions whenever I visited the house. Sometimes he would slide a newspaper article across the table and ask what I thought about a manufacturing merger happening in another state. Other times, he would ask how I approached financial reports when evaluating a company. He never made these conversations public during family dinners. They always happened quietly, when no one else was paying attention. I realized later that he was testing how I thought rather than what conclusions I reached. One afternoon when I was 27 and already working full-time in Chicago, he invited me to meet him for coffee near his apartment. He was 81 years old then, but still sharp in a way that made people underestimate him at first glance. During that conversation, he asked about my consulting work and listened carefully as I described how my team identified operational inefficiencies in manufacturing businesses. After I finished explaining a project involving warehouse logistics, he leaned back in his chair and smiled slightly. He said that if the Hayes family ever paid attention to the right numbers, they might notice that leadership potential does not always appear in the person everyone assumes will inherit the company. I laughed and told him that my father had been preparing Kyle to run Hayes Industrial for years. My grandfather stirred his coffee slowly and said something I did not fully understand at the time. He said that companies do not survive because of inheritance. They survive because someone notices problems before they become disasters. Then he told me to keep paying attention to the patterns other people ignore. That was the last long conversation we ever had about business. 2 years later, my grandfather passed away peacefully at the age of 83. At his memorial service, my father spoke proudly about continuing the Hayes legacy through the next generation of leadership. Kyle stood beside him, wearing a dark suit, while dozens of employees from the company attended to pay their respects. No one mentioned the quiet way my grandfather had always watched the details others overlooked. But I remembered every word he had said about numbers telling the truth if someone was willing to listen. And somewhere during those same years, Daniel had begun studying something else entirely, something connected to Hayes Industrial that I did not yet realize would eventually bring us all back to that ballroom. The first time I realized something unusual was happening inside my father's company was about 3 years before the retirement party, and the moment itself was so ordinary that I almost ignored it completely. Daniel and I were sitting at our kitchen table in our apartment in Chicago on a quiet Sunday evening while I reviewed a report from one of my consulting projects. Daniel had his laptop open beside a stack of financial documents from a manufacturing acquisition his firm was evaluating. At one point, he leaned back slightly in his chair and asked a casual question that caught my attention. He asked if Hayes Industrial had expanded its production facilities recently. I told him that my father had announced a major expansion 2 years earlier involving a new distribution warehouse outside Indianapolis. My father had described it as one of the biggest growth moves in the company's history. Daniel nodded slowly and asked whether the company had taken on new debt to finance the expansion. I told him I assumed they had because that was how most companies handled large capital investments. Daniel did not say anything else immediately, but I noticed him typing something into a spreadsheet on his computer. A few minutes later, he turned the laptop toward me and showed me a set of financial summaries pulled from publicly available corporate filings and supplier reports. Hayes Industrial was not a publicly traded corporation, but large vendors often released partial financial disclosures when negotiating contracts with partners. Daniel pointed at one column showing transportation costs and another showing inventory turnover rates over a 4-year period. The numbers looked slightly different than what I expected. Inventory movement had slowed by nearly 9% while operating costs had increased by almost 14% during the same time frame. Daniel asked whether that matched what I had heard about the company's internal performance. I told him honestly that I did not know because my father rarely discussed the actual numbers with me. Family conversations about the business focused mostly on how well Kyle was doing in management meetings and how the company was expanding into new markets. Daniel leaned forward and studied the data again for a moment before explaining something that immediately made my attention sharpen. He said that when a company expands rapidly without improving efficiency at the same time, the costs of maintaining that expansion can quietly grow faster than the revenue supporting it. He compared it to building a larger engine without strengthening the rest of the machine around it. At first, the engine appears powerful, but eventually the system begins to strain under the weight of its own complexity. Over the next several weeks, Daniel occasionally mentioned other small details he noticed while reviewing industry data connected to suppliers who worked with Hayes Industrial. None of it sounded dramatic by itself. A delayed shipment contract here. A supplier renegotiating payment schedules there. But when he explained how those details connected to larger financial patterns, I began recognizing something familiar. It was the same feeling I experienced during consulting projects when multiple small inefficiencies combined into a larger structural problem. One evening, I asked Daniel directly whether he thought my father's company was in trouble. Daniel paused before answering because he was always careful about drawing conclusions too quickly. He said he did not have enough internal information to make a definitive judgment, but the external indicators suggested that Hayes Industrial might be carrying more operational pressure than its leadership publicly acknowledged. I remember feeling a strange mix of concern and curiosity when he said that. Hayes Industrial had always been presented in our family as an unstoppable success story. My father described the company as a legacy built through decades of disciplined leadership. Kyle spoke confidently about future expansion projects and strategic acquisitions. The idea that the numbers might tell a more complicated story had never been discussed openly. Over the following year, Daniel's firm became involved in evaluating several manufacturing companies connected to the same regional supply chain as Hayes Industrial. Each time he examined industry reports, he noticed patterns that suggested certain suppliers were quietly adjusting their credit terms with Hayes Industrial in ways that indicated financial caution. None of those changes were public announcements. They appeared only in contract language and vendor disclosures that most people outside financial advisory work rarely studied closely. One night, Daniel explained that when suppliers begin shortening payment windows or requesting partial deposits in advance, it often means they are protecting themselves from delayed payments later. That conversation stayed in my mind long after we finished dinner that evening. At the time, I still believed that whatever was happening inside Hayes Industrial would eventually be corrected by my father and the leadership team. After all, the company had been operating successfully for decades. But Daniel continued watching the numbers with the same calm patience he applied to every investment evaluation. He never presented his observations as dramatic discoveries. Instead, he treated them as pieces of a larger puzzle that might eventually reveal a clearer picture. And during that same period, my father began preparing something he considered the most important public moment of his career. After 40 years running Hayes Industrial, he announced that he would retire the following spring with a large celebration honoring the legacy he believed he had secured for the next generation. The event would be held in a downtown Chicago ballroom with business partners, executives, and employees attending to celebrate the transition of leadership. Kyle would stand beside him as the future of the company. And at the time, none of them realized that Daniel had already been studying the same numbers my grandfather once told me always reveal the truth when someone is willing to listen. The months leading up to my father's retirement celebration felt like watching two completely different stories unfold at the same time. In my parents' world, everything looked like a perfect transition of power. My father spoke about the future of Hayes Industrial as if it had already been carefully handed to the next generation. Every family dinner included updates about Kyle's growing leadership inside the company. My mother described the upcoming retirement event as the culmination of 4 decades of dedication and success. She talked about the ballroom reservation, the guest list, and the speeches that would highlight the legacy my father believed he had built. The celebration was scheduled for a Friday evening in late spring at the Grand Harbor Hotel in downtown Chicago. Nearly 200 guests were invited, including senior executives, longtime employees, business partners, and industry contacts from across the Midwest. A stage would be set at the front of the ballroom with a large display showing photographs from the company's history, starting with a small workshop my grandfather once ran decades earlier. My father planned to give a speech reflecting on the journey of Hayes Industrial, and then formally present Kyle as the future leader who would carry the company forward. The event invitations described it as a tribute to leadership and continuity. Everything about it sounded polished and confident. Meanwhile, the other story was unfolding quietly in Daniel's office and late at night at our kitchen table. Daniel's firm had been analyzing a series of manufacturing investments across the region, and the deeper they examined the supply network surrounding Hayes Industrial, the more unusual the financial signals became. Suppliers were adjusting payment structures again. A transportation partner had quietly shortened their contract renewal window. One equipment vendor had shifted Hayes Industrial from a 30-day payment schedule to a 15-day schedule, which usually meant the vendor wanted faster confirmation that invoices would be covered. None of these adjustments were dramatic enough to appear in business news reports. They existed only inside contracts and financial disclosures that most people outside corporate advisory work rarely studied. Daniel explained that individually each change could be dismissed as routine business negotiation. But when multiple suppliers began making the same cautious adjustments, within a short period of time it suggested they were responding to something deeper in the company's financial structure. One evening he spread several printed reports across our kitchen table and showed me how the company's operating costs had gradually risen faster than revenue growth over a 3-year period. Transportation expenses had increased 12%. Equipment leasing costs had increased 9%. Warehouse overhead had increased 14% after the new distribution facility opened. Yet the company's overall production output had only increased by 5% during that same time frame. Daniel traced a line through the numbers with a pencil and explained that when operating costs expand faster than productivity, it creates pressure inside the balance sheet that leadership must either correct quickly or cover with additional borrowing. I asked him if that meant the company might eventually face serious financial trouble. Daniel responded carefully because he never liked to jump to conclusions before verifying all available information. He said it meant the company was likely carrying more risk than its public messaging suggested. The part that concerned him most was not the rising costs themselves, but the pattern of short-term loans appearing in the financial disclosures tied to supplier partnerships. Short-term financing can help stabilize operations temporarily, but it also increases vulnerability if revenue growth slows or unexpected expenses appear. Around that same time, my father began speaking about the retirement celebration almost every week. During one dinner, he proudly explained that several large clients would attend the event and that the evening would include a video presentation highlighting the company's 40-year history. He described how Kyle would stand beside him during the speech when he formally announced the next era of leadership. Everyone at the table listened politely while he outlined the moment in great detail. I noticed that Daniel listened quietly as well, without interrupting or offering any opinion. Later that night, when we returned home, I asked him what he thought about the transition my father was planning. Daniel sat silently for a moment before answering. He said that leadership transitions in companies under financial pressure can sometimes happen faster than expected once the numbers become impossible to ignore. I remember asking him whether he planned to say anything about what he had been discovering. He shook his head and said that information about private companies must be handled carefully because premature conclusions can damage reputations unfairly. But he also added something else that stayed in my mind. He said that if the financial patterns continued moving in the same direction, someone would eventually have to step forward and address them publicly. At the time, I assumed that responsibility would fall to the company's board of directors or senior executives once they reviewed the numbers themselves. I did not imagine that the moment when those numbers would finally be revealed would occur in a crowded ballroom filled with 200 guests celebrating a legacy that was far less stable than anyone in my family believed. The day of the retirement celebration arrived on a warm Friday evening in late May, the kind of evening when the air over downtown Chicago feels almost calm despite the constant movement of the city below. The Grand Harbor Hotel ballroom had been transformed into something that looked more like a corporate gala than a retirement event. Tall glass vases filled with white lilies stood at the center of every table. A long banner stretched across the stage, reading "Congratulations, Richard Hayes, 40 years of leadership." Large projection screens displayed photographs from the company's history, beginning with a faded black and white image of my grandfather standing beside the original Hayes workshop with only a few employees behind him. Guests began arriving just before 6 o'clock. Executives from several manufacturing firms shook hands near the entrance, while longtime employees from Hayes Industrial greeted each other like old friends. Servers moved quietly through the room, offering sparkling water and champagne on silver trays. My mother stood near the front greeting guests with the same warm smile she used during every major family event. Kyle wore a dark suit and moved confidently from table to table, speaking with investors and company managers, as if the role of future leader already belonged to him. Daniel and I arrived about 20 minutes after the doors opened. We were seated near the back of the ballroom at a table reserved for extended family and outside guests. From that position, we could see the entire room, including the stage where my father would soon give the speech he had been planning for months. The atmosphere felt polished and confident in the way corporate celebrations often do. Conversations floated across the room about new contracts, expansion opportunities, and the impressive growth Hayes Industrial had achieved over the decades. Several executives approached my father to congratulate him personally, while photographers captured images of the moment. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like the perfect ending to a long, successful career. I noticed something else, though. Daniel remained unusually quiet during the first hour of the evening. Normally, he enjoyed observing how business leaders interacted during large gatherings because those environments often revealed more about company culture than formal meetings ever did. But that night, his attention seemed focused more on the stage than the conversations happening around our table. At one point, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and briefly checked a slim folder before closing it again. I did not ask what was inside, because by then I trusted that Daniel never carried something like that without a clear reason. Dinner was served shortly after 7 o'clock. Plates of roasted salmon, seasonal vegetables, and rice were placed in front of the guests, while soft music played quietly from speakers along the ballroom walls. My father moved easily from table to table, shaking hands and thanking people for attending. When he reached our table, he greeted Daniel with a polite nod and asked if we were enjoying the evening. Daniel responded respectfully and congratulated him on reaching such an important milestone. My father smiled in approval and then turned to speak with another executive standing nearby. The formal program began around 8 o'clock when the lights dimmed slightly and a company director stepped onto the stage to introduce the video presentation about Hayes Industrial's history. The screen behind him displayed images from the early years of the business, including photographs of factory floors, shipping trucks, and ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new facilities. The video ended with a message thanking Richard Hayes for 4 decades of leadership and dedication. Applause filled the ballroom as the director invited my father onto the stage. My father walked up to the microphone with the confidence of someone completely comfortable speaking to a large audience. He adjusted the microphone slightly and looked out across the crowd with a satisfied smile. The room grew quiet as guests settled into their chairs to listen. He began by thanking everyone for attending and spoke about the long journey that had started with the small operation his father once built. He described the challenges of expanding the company into a major regional manufacturer and praised the employees who had helped make that growth possible. The speech moved smoothly through stories about early contracts, difficult negotiations, and the pride he felt watching Hayes Industrial become a respected name in the industry. Then he reached the moment he had clearly been anticipating all evening. He spoke about the importance of legacy and the responsibility of passing leadership to the next generation. He gestured toward the front tables where Kyle sat listening attentively and explained how proud he was to see his son ready to continue the company's future. Applause rose again from the audience. I stood near the back beside Daniel watching the scene unfold exactly as my father had planned it. But as the applause faded and my father lifted his glass for the next part of his speech, I felt a strange tension in the air beside me. Daniel had just stood up from his chair. Daniel did not move quickly when he stood up from the chair beside me. In fact, the calm way he pushed the chair back and straightened his jacket almost made the moment feel ordinary, as if he were simply walking to greet someone across the room. But I knew immediately that something important was about to happen because of the way he looked toward the stage. My father was still speaking into the microphone, describing the pride he felt watching Kyle prepare to lead the next generation of Hayes Industrial. Guests around the ballroom listened politely, while some nodded in agreement. The applause from the previous moment had just faded when Daniel began walking toward the stage. At first, only a few people noticed him moving through the room. Several executives sitting near the aisle turned their heads briefly as he passed. My father continued speaking without interruption because from the stage Daniel probably looked like another guest heading toward the front for a better view. But when Daniel reached the steps beside the stage and calmly stepped up onto the platform, the shift in the room became impossible to ignore. My father paused mid-sentence as Daniel approached the microphone stand beside him. The two of them stood there for a moment facing the audience. Nearly 200 guests watched in silence, unsure whether this interruption had been planned or not. Daniel leaned slightly toward my father and spoke quietly enough that the microphone did not pick up the words. My father frowned with a brief look of confusion before stepping slightly aside. Daniel then turned toward the audience and adjusted the microphone. The room grew completely quiet in the way large crowds do when something unexpected breaks the rhythm of a formal event. Daniel spoke in the same calm tone I had heard him use during countless business meetings. He began by thanking my father for inviting everyone together to celebrate the history of Hayes Industrial. His voice carried easily across the ballroom without any sign of tension. Then he said that before the evening continued there was an important piece of information that many of the company's partners and employees deserved to hear directly. I could feel the attention in the room sharpen immediately. People leaned slightly forward in their chairs while others exchanged uncertain glances. Daniel continued by explaining that his firm specialized in evaluating manufacturing companies experiencing structural financial pressure. Over the past 18 months, his firm had been quietly reviewing several companies within the regional supply network connected to Hayes Industrial. At this point, the confusion in the room was visible. A few executives whispered to each other while my father stood beside Daniel with a tight expression that looked more irritated than worried. Daniel opened the slim folder he had been carrying inside his jacket and placed several documents on the small podium beside the microphone. He then explained something that changed the entire atmosphere in the room within seconds. Hayes Industrial, he said, had been experiencing rising operational costs combined with slowing inventory turnover for several years. To maintain stability, the company had taken on a series of short-term financial arrangements with suppliers and lenders. Those arrangements had allowed the company to continue operating while leadership searched for a long-term restructuring solution. Daniel paused for a moment as the audience processed what he had just said. The quiet in the ballroom deepened as people realized this was not part of a retirement tribute speech. Daniel then explained that his firm had been working with a group of investors who specialized in stabilizing companies facing exactly this type of financial pressure. Over the previous year, those investors had gradually acquired controlling shares of Hayes Industrial through a structured restructuring agreement approved by the company's lenders. I saw several executives sitting near the front of the room suddenly turn toward each other with expressions of disbelief. My father looked at Daniel sharply, but remained silent. Daniel continued speaking clearly into the microphone. He explained that the restructuring agreement had been finalized earlier that week and would allow Hayes Industrial to continue operating while reducing debt obligations and improving operational efficiency over the next several years. He then lifted one of the documents from the podium and said something that caused the entire room to fall into absolute silence. The lead investor group responsible for stabilizing Hayes Industrial, he said, would now oversee the company's financial restructuring moving forward. And the representative responsible for guiding that transition would be standing right there in the room. For several seconds after Daniel finished that sentence, the ballroom remained completely silent in a way that felt almost unreal. 200 people sat frozen in their chairs trying to understand what they had just heard. The soft music that had been playing earlier had already stopped, and the only sound left in the room was the quiet hum of the hotel air system above the chandeliers. Daniel stood calmly at the microphone while the documents rested on the podium in front of him. My father remained beside him on the stage with an expression that had shifted from irritation to something closer to disbelief. Kyle had risen halfway out of his chair near the front table, staring toward the stage as if he expected someone to laugh and reveal that the entire announcement had been a misunderstanding. Daniel allowed the silence to settle for a moment before he continued speaking. He explained that the investor group responsible for stabilizing Hayes Industrial had worked quietly over the previous 18 months to restructure the company's debt and secure agreements with suppliers and lenders. Without that restructuring, he said, the financial pressure building inside the company would have eventually forced a far more disruptive outcome for employees and partners. Several executives in the front rows exchanged tense glances because the implications were becoming clearer by the second. Daniel then lifted one of the documents from the podium and held it up slightly so the audience could see the official heading printed across the top of the page. He explained that the document represented the finalized restructuring agreement approved by the company's primary lenders earlier that week. Under the terms of that agreement, the investor group had acquired controlling ownership of Hayes Industrial in exchange for stabilizing the company's financial structure and guaranteeing operational continuity. A quiet ripple of whispers moved across the ballroom as people processed what that meant. The company many of them had believed my father still controlled was no longer solely under his authority. Daniel continued with the same steady tone he had used since stepping onto the stage. He explained that the investor group had not come to dismantle the company or erase its history. Their goal was to preserve the business my grandfather had originally built while correcting the operational problems that had been growing beneath the surface for several years. He then placed the document back onto the podium and said something that shifted the attention of the entire room in a new direction. The investor group, he explained, believed the future of Hayes Industrial would depend on leadership capable of recognizing financial patterns early and responding to them with careful strategy rather than pride. For that reason, the group had selected a new operational partner to guide the company through its restructuring phase. Daniel paused briefly and then turned slightly toward the back of the ballroom where I had been standing beside our table during the entire announcement. I felt every pair of eyes in the room suddenly turning in the same direction. Daniel said that the person chosen to help oversee the restructuring already understood the company's industry, supply chains, and operational inefficiencies better than most consultants who had studied the business from the outside. Several executives looked confused while others began glancing between Daniel and me as if a realization was slowly forming. Daniel then explained that this individual had spent nearly a decade analyzing manufacturing operations across the Midwest, identifying inefficiencies and restructuring production systems for companies facing challenges similar to those Hayes Industrial now needed to address. My father stared at Daniel with a tightening expression as if he already suspected what was coming next, but could not stop it from happening. Daniel finally said my name clearly into the microphone. He explained that I had been invited by the investor group to serve as the operational advisor responsible for guiding Hayes Industrial through its restructuring plan over the next several years. The reaction inside the ballroom was immediate, but strangely quiet. Instead of loud gasps or dramatic exclamations, there was simply a stunned stillness as people absorbed the full meaning of what had just been announced. The daughter my father had just described as someone who needed to be carried by her husband was now being introduced as the professional selected to help stabilize the very company he had spent his speech celebrating. Daniel looked out across the audience and finished by explaining that the decision had not been based on family connections or personal loyalty. It had been based entirely on professional experience, analytical skill, and the ability to recognize financial problems long before they became public crises. For a long moment, no one in the ballroom moved at all. The entire room seemed suspended in silence, while the reality of the situation settled over every table, every executive, and every employee who had come that evening expecting a simple retirement celebration. For several long seconds after Daniel finished speaking, no one in the ballroom moved. It felt as if the entire room had collectively forgotten how to breathe. I could see the expressions on the faces of executives who had spent decades working beside my father, and none of them looked angry or outraged. They looked stunned, the way people do when the story they believed about a situation suddenly changes in front of them. My father stood beside Daniel on the stage, with one hand resting on the edge of the podium, as if he needed something solid to hold on to. The confident posture he had maintained throughout his speech had disappeared. Instead, he looked around the ballroom searching for some kind of explanation that would return the evening to the script he had expected. Kyle was still standing near the front table, his chair pushed slightly backward. He looked from Daniel to the documents on the podium and then toward me in the back of the room with an expression that mixed disbelief and confusion. The executives seated near him began whispering quietly to one another, but even those conversations were careful and restrained because everyone understood that what had just been revealed was not a rumor or speculation. It was a legal restructuring agreement already approved by lenders and investors. Daniel did not rush the moment. He allowed the silence to settle naturally before he spoke again. His tone remained steady and respectful, the same tone he had used from the beginning. He explained that the purpose of the announcement was not to embarrass anyone or diminish the history of the company. Hayes Industrial, he said, had survived for decades because many talented people had contributed to its growth. The restructuring agreement existed to protect those employees and ensure that the company could continue operating for many years into the future. Several employees seated near the middle tables nodded slowly as they listened because they understood what financial instability could mean for hundreds of jobs if it were not addressed carefully. Daniel then turned slightly toward my father and acknowledged the decades of work that had gone into building the company. He said that every organization eventually reaches moments where difficult decisions must be made in order to protect the people who depend on it. The investor group had chosen a restructuring path that preserved the company rather than allowing the financial pressure to grow until the situation became impossible to correct. My father listened to this explanation without interrupting. His expression had changed from shock to something quieter, almost reflective, as if he were realizing that the numbers Daniel had described were real problems he had not fully confronted. Daniel then explained how the next phase of the company's transition would work. The investor group would provide financial oversight while operational improvements were implemented across manufacturing facilities and supply chains. Those improvements would focus on reducing unnecessary costs, improving inventory flow, and strengthening supplier relationships that had been strained by the previous financial pressure. As he described the plans, several executives in the audience began nodding again because the strategy sounded familiar to anyone who had worked in manufacturing for long enough. Companies often survived difficult transitions only when someone stepped forward with a clear plan rather than continuing to pretend the problem did not exist. Daniel then stepped slightly away from the microphone and looked toward me again. Even though I had been standing quietly beside our table during the entire announcement, I suddenly felt every person in the room watching as if the spotlight had shifted from the stage to the back of the ballroom. Daniel gestured gently toward the aisle and said that the operational advisor he had just introduced would now help lead the effort to stabilize the company's systems and rebuild its efficiency over the next several years. For a moment I hesitated because walking toward the stage meant stepping directly into the center of a moment my father had never imagined. But I also remembered what my grandfather had once told me about numbers revealing the truth when someone was willing to listen. So I stepped into the aisle and began walking slowly toward the front of the room. The ballroom remained silent except for the soft sound of my shoes crossing the carpet. When I reached the stage, Daniel offered a small reassuring smile before stepping slightly aside, so I could stand beside the podium. I looked out across the audience and saw employees, executives, and partners who had come expecting a simple retirement celebration. Instead, they were witnessing the beginning of a complicated but necessary transition. I did not speak immediately because the moment itself carried enough meaning without dramatic words. After a few seconds, I simply thanked the people in the room for the work they had done over the years to support the company and explained that the goal of the restructuring was not to erase the past, but to protect the future. The quiet in the ballroom remained, but this time it felt different. It was no longer confusion. It was the calm silence of people recognizing that the story of Hayes Industrial had just changed direction in front of them. The silence in the ballroom lasted longer than most people probably realized because moments like that stretch time in strange ways. Standing beside the podium, I could see every expression in the front rows clearly. Some people looked thoughtful, some looked uneasy, and others seemed almost relieved that the situation had been explained openly rather than continuing quietly behind the scenes. Daniel remained a step behind me on the stage, giving me the space to speak without overshadowing the moment he had just created. For most of my life, family gatherings had placed me at the edge of the room rather than the center of attention, so standing in front of 200 people felt unusual, but not overwhelming. In fact, the calm I felt surprised me. Perhaps it was because the moment no longer belonged to my father's expectations or the assumptions my family had repeated for years. It belonged to the truth the numbers had revealed. I explained briefly that restructuring a company is not about assigning blame or rewriting history. It is about protecting the employees who depend on the business and making sure the systems that support that work are strong enough to last. I said that Hayes Industrial still had skilled workers, reliable suppliers, and strong demand for its products. The company simply needed a more disciplined operational structure to match the scale it had grown into. As I spoke, I noticed several long-time employees sitting near the center tables nodding slowly. They understood better than anyone how quickly small inefficiencies could build into serious challenges inside a manufacturing operation. When I finished explaining the next steps of the restructuring plan, the room remained quiet for a moment longer before something unexpected happened. One of the senior plant managers who had worked at Hayes Industrial for more than 20 years began clapping. The sound echoed softly through the ballroom. Another employee joined him, then another. Within seconds, a steady round of applause moved through the room. It was not loud or celebratory in the way earlier applause had been during my father's speech. Instead, it felt thoughtful and deliberate, the kind of applause people give when they recognize honesty even if the message is difficult to hear. My father stood beside the podium, watching the reaction from the audience. For a long moment, he did not move. Then he stepped forward and placed both hands on the edge of the podium. The applause faded as people realized he was about to speak again. When he looked out across the room, his voice sounded different from earlier in the evening. The confident tone he had used during his retirement speech had softened into something more reflective. He said that leading a company for 4 decades teaches a person many lessons, but one of the hardest lessons is accepting that success does not make anyone immune to mistakes. He acknowledged that the company had expanded faster than its internal systems had adapted, and that he should have paid closer attention to the warning signs appearing in the financial reports. Hearing those words from him created another quiet moment across the ballroom because many people in the room had never heard my father speak with that level of humility before. He then turned slightly toward me and said something that I never expected to hear publicly. He said that sometimes the people we underestimate the most are the ones who see problems we overlook because they are not blinded by pride or tradition. The room remained still as he continued. He admitted that I had spent years developing the kind of analytical perspective the company now needed, even though he had not always recognized its value. The acknowledgement was not dramatic or emotional. It was simply honest. When he finished speaking, he stepped back from the microphone and looked out across the audience once more before nodding toward Daniel and me. The message was clear. The future of the company was moving forward in a different direction than he had once imagined, but he was willing to accept that reality. As the audience slowly began speaking again, and people stood from their tables, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from shock to cautious conversation. Executives approached the stage to ask questions about the restructuring plan while employees discussed how the changes might affect operations at their facilities. In the middle of that growing movement, I noticed Daniel watching quietly from beside the stage with the same calm expression he always carried during important negotiations. The evening that had begun as a retirement celebration had transformed into something far more complicated, but also far more honest than anyone expected. The ballroom slowly began returning to the quiet rhythm of conversation, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that everyone could feel even if no one said it directly. Earlier in the evening, the event had been built around a single story about legacy and succession. Now that story had been replaced by something far more grounded in reality. Groups of executives stood together near the front of the room discussing the restructuring plan while several long-time employees approached the stage to shake Daniel's hand and thank him for explaining the situation openly. I stepped down from the platform beside him, and for a few minutes the two of us answered practical questions about the next steps for the company. Most of the questions were not emotional at all. They were the kind of questions people ask when they care about the future of their work. Would the manufacturing plants remain open? Would supplier contracts continue without interruption? Would the restructuring create opportunities to improve production efficiency rather than cutting staff? Each answer Daniel and I gave focused on the same principle. The goal was not to dismantle Hayes Industrial, but to rebuild the structure beneath it so the company could grow without carrying hidden financial pressure. Eventually, the conversations began to spread across the room again as people returned to their tables to talk among themselves. I noticed my father standing near the stage speaking quietly with several senior managers. His posture looked different than it had earlier in the evening. Instead of presenting himself as the central figure of the event, he was listening carefully while others shared their thoughts about the company's future. Kyle stood nearby with his arms folded, watching the discussions with a thoughtful expression. For the first time in years, he looked less like someone being prepared to inherit a company and more like someone considering what role he might choose to play moving forward. A little later, my father approached Daniel and me while the crowd continued talking around us. For a moment, he simply looked at the two of us without speaking. Then he extended his hand to Daniel in a gesture that carried more meaning than any formal speech could have. He said that while the evening had unfolded differently than he expected, he understood that protecting the company and its employees mattered more than protecting his pride. Daniel shook his hand respectfully and assured him that the restructuring would honor the history of Hayes Industrial rather than erase it. My father then turned toward me with an expression that was calmer than I had ever seen at a public event. He said that leadership sometimes requires recognizing when someone else sees the path forward more clearly than you do. It was not an apology in the dramatic sense, but it was honest in a way that meant far more. The rest of the evening gradually settled into a quieter gathering. Guests continued talking while the hotel staff cleared dinner plates and refreshed glasses of sparkling water. The stage lights dimmed slightly as the formal part of the program ended, leaving only the soft glow of the chandeliers above the tables. Daniel and I eventually stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the Chicago River to breathe the cool night air after the intensity of the ballroom. From there we could see the city lights reflecting across the water, while boats moved slowly along the river below. I asked Daniel if he had known the announcement would unfold exactly the way it did. He smiled gently and said that in business you can prepare carefully for the truth to emerge, but you can never control exactly how people will react when they hear it. What mattered was that the numbers had finally been acknowledged, and the company now had a chance to rebuild its future on something stronger than assumptions. In the months that followed, the restructuring began moving forward step by step. Operational reviews improved inventory systems, supplier relationships were stabilized, and production schedules became far more efficient than they had been in years. Many of the same employees who attended the retirement event became the strongest supporters of the changes because they could see the difference in how the company functioned day to day. My father adjusted to retirement more quietly than anyone expected. Instead of attending every corporate meeting, he spent more time visiting the original workshop building my grandfather had started decades earlier. Sometimes he would sit in the small office there and watch the manufacturing floor the way my grandfather once had, observing rather than directing. Looking back, now I understand that the evening at the hotel ballroom was not really about one speech or one announcement. It was about a moment when the truth hidden inside years of numbers finally had the chance to speak out loud. And once that truth was heard, the future of the company no longer depended on pride or tradition. It depended on the willingness to listen.